Hello and welcome, friends. I hope everybody's having a great day so far. If you are new here, welcome. And if you're back, welcome back. I greatly appreciate all of the ongoing support. This is my channel, Dragon's Jewel Creative Gems, and I'm Tegan. And I'm just going to get all those wonderful YouTubey stuff out of the way. If you haven't hit that subscribe button yet, please consider doing so. It's just down below. And if you like the content, please make sure you're hitting the like button on the videos. And of course, if you want to share some love down in the comments below, it's always greatly appreciated. And I absolutely love reading them. I do my best to make sure that I respond back and share some love in your direction as well, because naturally without you, this channel wouldn't exist. And I appreciate each and every one of you. And I thought I would bring some of those Halloween spooky vibes to the channel. There are going to be in the WIP and Chat style format, but I'm going to read some ghost stories of Alberta, which is the province that I reside in. And they're all short stories, so depending how long each story is, you might get one or two read, or you might get a few more than that. I'm not sure yet exactly how they're going to work out, but I'm going to be doing, like I said, in WIP and Chat format, so I will have a spooky canvas that I'll be working on, and then I'm going to read a couple of ghost stories so that you can listen along while you dab and paint, or work on another craft, or what you normally do during WIP and Chats kind of thing, and I keep you company with some spooky tales from my province. So I figured that would be fun. The Ghost of the PMQ. Imagine having to make room in your life for a ghost with a penchant for performing Uri Geller sort of tricks. Don and Bobby Miller lived with just such a spirit during their first year in Edmonton. In 1982, Don was a search and rescue technician, recently transferred to the Canadian Forces Base, Edmonton. The strange incidents the couple experienced for those first few months of their PMQ, permanent married quarters, have left an indelible impression on their memories. They also remember their hesitancy to discuss the phenomenon with anyone. We kept the accounting pretty well to ourselves. The armed forces takes a dim view of their personnel seeing ghosts in the PMQs and then coming to work. The man explained before asking to be identified by a pseudonym. Giving the intensity of the following story, his concerns about being identified were more than understandable. In June of 1982, Don and Bobby Miller were a young married couple with a 4-year-old son. Don's career with the military meant frequent moves, so when they were informed of the transfer to Edmonton, the couple accepted it as routine, and for the first 2 months it appeared all was normal. As they planned during her pregnancy, Bobby stayed home to care for their son Philip. This meant that the young mother was in the house a great deal, and because she hadn't had time to make new friends, she was often by herself with the baby. What might have been a lonely time for a woman was relived by her thorough enjoyment of her new role as a mother, and besides, for the first time in a long time, she was living close to relatives. Little did Bobby suspect that she'd soon have even more in her life to ward off any possibility of loneliness. The Millers are animal lovers, and at the time they owned a very large crossbreed dog named Misty, and a black cat, Willow. The animals were the first to realize that they were living in a haunted house. Despite numerous strange going-ons, the human members of the family weren't quite so easily convinced. At first, it is always little things, and we kept making excuses, Don said, and we had hung a dream catcher on the ceiling in one corner of the living room, Don explained. The dog and the cat would sit absolutely motionless for hours staring at the hoop. At first, merely puzzled by the animal's behavior, Don and Bobby were soon forced to accept that there was something abnormal occurring. The animals were definitely watching something that their owners could not see. The dream catcher was a large one. Its hoop measured about 30 centimeters across and hung from the ceiling and twirled about freely whenever the furnace came on or a breeze blew through the open window. One day, however, Bobby noticed the dream catcher turning when there were no drafts or air currents to propel it. Worse, the device was only turning one direction. The line on which it hung never shortened. Sometimes it would spin very fast, absolutely go crazy, Bob remembered. At the time, she currently never suspected that the ornament's activity was her introduction to life with an amazingly vigorous spirit. Despite its energy level, whoever or whatever the Millers shared their military-supplied home with apparently meant them no harm. There never seemed to be any malevolence or harm intended, they concurred. These were more childish, attention-getting behaviors. Bobby's claim acceptance of its antics and seemed to prompt the phantom into further tricks. Its next target was one with which many specters enjoyed tinkering, the television set. It was an old television. The channel selector was the old rotary type. It didn't easily turn, Dawn explained, adding that the dial was so stiff that it turned with more of a clunk than a click. One evening, as Dawn sat enjoying a television show, the channel selector suddenly turned to another setting. Annoyed by the disruption to his viewing, Dawn switched the knob back to where it had been, like his wife. He had never suspected at the time that he had just had his first experience with a ghost. He didn't report his experience to Bobby for a few days, and by then the channel changing had become annoyingly frequent. After a few sessions of unwanted channel surfing, accompanied by a spinning dream catcher, however, the two began to discuss the strange events they'd each noted but had never mentioned. It happens all the time, Bobby responded when Dawn told her about his experience with the television dial. Bobby was very comfortable with the whole thing, Dawn said. I wasn't. I wasn't scared by it. I just wasn't very comfortable. The next time the dial on the television moved, I got mad. This time, rather than get up and turn the selector back to the channel he'd been watching, Dawn exclaimed, I own the television, now turn the damn thing back. As he watched, the dial moved back to where it had been. From that point on, the paranormal activity in the nondescript permanent Mary Quarters duplex was continual. There was always something, Bobby added. There were 2 bedrooms in the house, both on the 2nd floor. We used the room across from our bedroom as a combination spare room, storage, sewing, and utility room, Dawn said. One reason that room was chosen as a spare room was it always felt cold. Neither of the Millers' pets would go into the room. It was one of the ghosts' favorite places. We kept photo albums in the closet in that room. In the one of the albums, Bobby kept the snapshots and postcards she'd brought back from her trip to Germany. A few of those pictures from the album began turning up on the guest bed in that room, Dawn recalled. No one else had been upstairs in their home, and so Bobby asked her husband if he'd gotten the pictures out. When he told her that he hadn't, she refiled them into their allocated spots. She wrote the incident off as best she could, while nevertheless acknowledging the growing collection of bizarre events she'd experienced in her new home. The pictures being laid out on the bed soon became as regular as the dreamcatcher's unprovoked twirling. By the time the same 2 pictures had appeared on the bed several times, Bobby was convinced that Dawn was playing a practical joke on her. She was annoyed and took the incident up with her husband. I knew I wasn't doing it, so I told Bobby to wait until I was gone to work one day and then hide the photographs somewhere, and don't tell me where they were. That way, when they reappeared, she'd know for sure I had nothing to do with it, Dawn said. Sure enough, 2 days later, they were on the bed. It was always the same ones, too. but then the spare room had become a focal point for increased paranormal activity. The Millers owned a very old, heavy Underwood typewriter, which they kept in that room. It sat on top of an antique sewing machine cabinet. One day I walked past the doorway to the spare room, and there was the typewriter on the floor, Bobby remembered. There was certainly no way a machine weighing at least 13 or 14 kilograms could have fallen from its stand without Bobby hearing it. Besides, it's doubtful that it would have landed in such a nice, neat, upright position beside the sewing machine. Not knowing what else to do, the woman lifted the old typewriter back onto the sewing machine cabinet. At the time, she could not have imagined all the ghostly going-ons that would soon revolve around the antique typewriter, nor the resident spirit strength was steadily increasing. There was much more to come for the Millers and their military housing. The dream catcher still spun frequently for no apparent reason, and the family pets still stared intently in that direction for hours. Willow the cat, however, would also stare into the upstairs room, in much the way that she did in one corner of the living room. Misty's reactions was even more interesting. The well-trained and normally obedient dog absolutely refused to enter the spare room, no matter how he was coaxed or ordered. Both animals clearly sensed something very strange in that room. It seemed just as Dawn and Bobby became adjusted to each of the spirit's hijinks, it added another one to its repertoire. Despite the spirit's determination to attract attention to itself, it only allowed itself to be seen once, just for a few seconds, if in fact it even was the same spirit. One morning, as he stood atop of the stairs looking down, Don saw what he thinks might have been poltergeist. She was standing at the bottom of the stairs. She was slender and had shoulder-length hair. She wore a dark dress with flowers, he recalled. Utterly astonished by what he was seeing, he wanted to share the experience with Bobby. And yet, I had the sense that if I turned away, the ghost wouldn't be there when I turned back. And that is exactly what happened. Although deeply disappointed that his wife wasn't able to see the image, Don's convictions never wavered. I stand by what I saw, the no-nonsense man stated firmly. Given the contradiction between the image, Don saw that the type of ghostly activity they'd been experiencing, it's possible that the apparition at the bottom of the stairs was another, more passive spirit. She may have been in the house all along, or she may have just been passing by that one morning. Bobby may not have seen the image that Dawn did, but she continued to be aware of a presence in her home. She took to glancing into the spare room each time she passed it, and when she found the typewriter on the floor, she would calmly put it back onto the sewing machine cabinet. Then, while going about her chores on the main floor of the house one day, Bobby heard the readily identifiable sound of typing coming from upstairs. That was enough. Thinking that taking it out of the spare room would end the activity with the typewriter, she lugged the heavy old machine down to the basement and set it in the floor. At least here it couldn't fall again. The relocation, however, didn't stop the sounds typing. During this period, the quality of the Miller's life had slipped. It was a stressful time, Bobby confirmed. As a search and rescue technician, Don was obligated to stay in excellent physical condition, and previously he'd taken pride in his good health. Soon, despite paying the same amount of attention to his well-being that he always had, Don's health started to suffer. He began to experience a string of unrelated illnesses, and at one point was even hospitalized. At the time, the couple didn't associate Don's declining health with their undeniably strange living conditions. In retrospect, however, they were suspicious that the two were connected. For the first time, however, the Millers could do little but struggle on as best as they were able. The photographs continued to appear on the bed in the spare room, and the dream catcher continued its unprovoked spinning. The typewriter, even from its new station in the basement, continued to sound as though someone was typing on it when no one was anywhere near the machine. One day, while listening to the typewriter, keys clunking away rhythmically downstairs, Bobby got an idea. Later that day, when all was quiet, she went into the basement and rolled a fresh piece of paper into the typewriter. Oddly, it seemed, the inserting the paper apparently stopped the spirit's interest in the typewriter. At first, anyways. For a while, the Millers saw no new paranormal activity in their haunted house. Then one morning, when Bobby came downstairs to make breakfast, she was greeted by a sight she can never forget. All the cutlery in the drawer was bent in half. Every knife, fork, and spoon had been effectively folded over on itself. Presuming this mayhem to be a work of their resident phantom, Bobby ordered the present to repair the damage it had done. Then she went back upstairs and stayed there for some time, attending to more routine matters. When she returned to the kitchen, the cutlery had been straightened. The ghost was clearly gaining power, and once the Millers suspected that it had even followed them to the grocery store. As they pushed a shopping cart down the aisle, both Bobby and Dawn felt a shove at the middle of their backs. They spun around first to face each other, wondering whether the other one had also felt the force, or even perhaps instigated it. Who could possibly have pushed them? There was no one there, and we were in the middle of the aisle, so there was no way anyone could have pushed us, and then ducked around a corner, Dawn explained. By now the two thought they were resigned to the spirit's hijinks. Then one day, Bobby's mother called. Knowing that Dawn would be working, she invited her daughter and grandson to come for dinner. Pleased to have the visit to look forward to, Bobby returned to her day's routine. Not long afterwards, she heard a noise coming from the basement. Someone, or something, was busy typing. Revealing her admirably calm and accepting nature, Bobby waited until the sound stopped, then went down to the basement. Even from a distance, she could see there was a message on the piece of paper that she'd rolled into the machine weeks before. Her foresight had finally paid off. She pulled the sheet out from the roller and was immediately disappointed to discover she was not dealing with a deeply philosophical ghost. There, where all the answers to the world's great unknowns could have been revealed, was the simple message, "Have a pleasant time at your parents' home." Bobby had just received a direct communication from the ghost she'd known for months existed. Admittedly a bit unnerved, the young woman's overriding feeling was one of frustration at the mundane nature of the message. It seemed nothing more than the ghostly equivalent of the standard and virtually meaningless "have a nice day." Although Bobby never left paper in the typewriter again, she and Dawn both continued to hear the keys being depressed as the machine sat unattended on the floor in their basement, and they weren't the only ones to be aware of the PMQ's phantom typist. Dawn explained in the summer of 1982, friends of ours moved from Cold Lake to Edmonton. Their son Damien would occasionally babysit our son. One evening, while sitting, he became frightened. He heard the typewriter in the basement and went to check it out. The young man stood and watched in horrified amazement as the typewriter's keys repeatedly depressed one after another, as if an invisible typist was at work. Working conditions, the spooky, were more than Damien could accept. He picked up Philip and bolted for the door. Fortunately, for the safety of his own unhaunted home was nearby. Though all these events, and because at the time she didn't connect Dawn's continuing health problems with the ghostly present, Bobby had remained unconcerned and went about life as though nothing out of the ordinary were happening. In a strange way, it was company for me, she recalled, the persistent spirit in the PMQ. however, was about to go too far and lose Bobby's acceptance. One afternoon, I put the baby down for his nap. He was about 6 months old at the time. A couple of hours later, I heard him waking up and went upstairs to get him out of the crib. Bobby only got as far as the bedroom doorway. There, neatly stacked on top of Philip's burrow, stood every article of clothing the baby owned. When the young mother had put her son into his crib earlier the afternoon, his clothing had been in the bureau drawers where it belonged. Even though all proud parents think their children are very advanced intellectually and physically, Bobby knew that there was no way that a 6-month-old Philip would have been capable of getting out of his crib, let alone opening dresser drawers and sorting through his own clothes until they stood in a pile. The ghost had exceeded what her maternal instincts would allow by indicating an interest in her child. Bobby Miller was ready to look for a new house. Dawn, who had never been as easygoing as Bobby about living in a haunted house, concurred, and using the ruse of needing a roomier place, they began to inquire about some vacant homes on the base. Within a short time, they moved to a new place. Dawn's health began to improve noticeably, as did the family's overall contentment with life. As the couple put the past as far behind them as they could, the couple who rented the Miller former home, however, did not fare so well. Their marriage ended within 6 months of moving into the haunted residence, and it's not known whether the marriage was already in jeopardy when they moved into place. It's impossible to assess whether or not the PMQ's long-standing, usually invisible resident was a factor in the separation. The dwelling is still standing and apparently occupied, but the Millers are no longer associated with the military and no longer live in Edmonton. Haven't bothered checking into the supernatural activity level in their old home. It is clear, however, that the ghost did not follow them, for the Millers have gone on to lead happy, successful lives. Missing links. On April 20th, 1962, housewife Paris Willie phoned the Edmonton police to report her husband, Frank Willie, missing. To date, the man has not been located. All that ever turned up were pools of blood and minute particles of hair and fabric. That grisly evidence was discovered inside a partially constructed house in the southeast Edmonton. It certainly wasn't much for the police to go on, but those findings were sufficient for them to conclude that Frank Willie had been murdered just hours before his wife telephoned them. The case was a gruesome and convoluted puzzle. Frank had been a dashing figure, a well-liked professional golfer who routinely carried large sums of money. On the surface, Frank Willie appeared to have had it all. He was married, the father of 2 boys, happily employed, and he owned a nicer than average home overlooking Edmonton's North Saskatchewan River. Now he had vanished. In spite of extensive searches, Frank's body was never found. Amazingly, the police were still able to solve the crime. An intelligent and tenacious criminal investigation led to the arrests and eventual conviction of the murderers. The quiet capital of Alberta had never witnessed such a case before. Flamboyant characters, a love triangle, huge sums of money, and a missing body all combined to create a ghoulishly interesting diversion for the general public. Despite the clearly incriminating case the police built against them, neither Bill Hukuluk nor Ray Workman ever confessed to the murder of Frank Willie. Maintaining their innocence to the bitter end, they were each sentenced to a lengthy incarceration. Ray Workman, suspected leader of the two, died while serving his time, effectively making his term a life sentence. One piece of the puzzle, however, remains missing to this day. Where is Frank Willie's body? The Shaws of southeast Edmonton think they may know the answer. Mr. Shaw, who prefers that his first name not be used, is a plumber. In the spring of 1962, while the intriguing case of Frank Willie swirled through the normally quiet government town, Mr. Shaw contracted to install the plumbing in a new house in the Fulton Place neighborhood. When the general contractor who hired him went broke, Mr. Shaw decided to buy the place. It would make an excellent home for his family, he reasoned, and because his employer needed money quickly, he could get it at a good price. Mr. Shaw, his wife Edna, and their 2 children moved in shortly afterwards. From the day of the move, it became apparent that they bought a haunted house. Between the arrivals of truckloads of furniture at their new house, Edna drove to a nearby restaurant to buy a meal of takeout food. She left her daughter to start unpacking. Edna returns some 20 minutes later to find a badly shaken daughter. The child had distinctively heard a tune being whistled. The music came from the basement. A thorough search turned up no possible source for the sounds. From the first instance onwards, something or someone seemed to be trying to demonstrate its presence. When the children's grandparents stayed in the house to babysit, they frequently heard the very distinctive sound of the garage door being opened. At each occurrence, they checked the attached garage and found the door closed, as it had been left. The family occasionally heard footsteps coming up the basement stairs. Once, after watching the doorknob turning, Edna Shaw ran to it and swung the door open. There was no one there, no one that she could see. Children in the neighborhood reported to the Shaws that via an Ouija board they'd contacted the ghosts that haunted their house, and he identified himself by the initials FW. Following that incident, the couple tried to get their resident spirit to make himself known more clearly to them. His only reply to their invitation seemed to be a continuation of his hijinks. Mr. Shaw operated his plumbing business from the house. He kept petty cash for the company in a strongbox. It was always locked, and only Edna knew the combination. When the women returned from a trip and opened the box, she found all the coins in it neatly sorted and stacked. She had not left them that way. We always felt he went out of his way to make his presence known to us, the woman explained, but he never made us feel uncomfortable. Perhaps this lack of discomfort is more a credit to the Shaw's ability to take life's oddities in stride than to any intention of the ghost's part. Few people could have related the following incident as calmly as the Shaws did. In a rarely used section of the basement, Edna found a cotton comforter that the family had been storing. It had been unrolled and was now laying on the cement floor. There was an imprint of a body in the center of the material. Not wanting an untidy home, Edna Shaw bent to re-roll the blanket. Where the imprint of the body was, the comforter had adhered to the floor. The community of Fulton Place is situated a short distance from the house where Frank Willie was murdered. At the time of his murder, the Shaw's future home was nearly completion. The ground that would soon become the garage pad had been loosened, leveled, and roped off in preparation for the concrete truck's arrival. It would not have required much effort for workmen in Hukliak to dig a shallow grave in the prepared soil, deposit the golfer's body into the hollow, and replace the dirt. Subsequently, the unsuspecting concrete pouring crew would effectively and permanently hide the evidence of workmen in Huliak's murderous deed. When the Shaw family decided to sell the haunted house, the decision had nothing to do with its resident spirit. It was merely time to move on. Today, the house remains occupied, and on a recent drive past the address, renovations were noted. The garage door under which Frank Willie's body likely lies entombed is now a cozy-looking family room. It's not known whether or not the spirit of the murdered man performs his attention-getting hijinks for the new owners, or whether he's gone on to play golf into eternity. Negative, noisy spirit. While collecting ghost stories over the years, I've been interested to occasionally note the emergence of patterns. For instance, a sudden drop in temperature is a strong indication of the presence of a spirit. Another common theme is the sensitivity of children to paranormal activity. I have also heard a number of stories that indicate that the intensity of a haunting can increase or decrease depending on the atmosphere created in the home. Significant amounts of positive energy can apparently overpower a negative presence in a home. A young woman once confided that she suspected that there had been a malevolent spirit in the house that she and her husband had purchased a few years before. The couple had always enjoyed a positive relationship until they moved into their new house. After the move, the bond soured almost immediately and the two began fighting. We actually split up at one point, she told me. Fortunately, we were able to work things out. We still live in the house and we're happy there now, but it really did feel as though we've overcome some kind of negative force in that house. It was just so uncomfortable in there at first. We knew when we bought it that the reason the house was for sale was because the couple who had owned it had separated. I always wondered about that. In another example of this phenomenon, a story in this book, The House Had an Evil Spirit, tells of a youngster being aware that there was something malignant in a small section of the family's home. After being occupied by a large, boisterous family for years, the house sat vacant for a time. When the young man returned, intending only to sleep overnight at the old family homestead, he found that the negative presence that had once been confined to a small area had grown in both intensity and size to such a degree that he could not stay there. I suspect the following haunted house story reflects much the same phenomenon. Darwin Christensen began his explanation of the events that he had endured with a disclaimer of sorts. He told me I had lived in that house for 9 years. These definitely weren't house noises I was hearing. I knew the noises that house made. The house in question is about 40 years old, a bungalow divided into 2 suites. Darwin was only 17 and just out of high school when he and a friend moved into the basement suite. By the second summer, my friend had moved out, so I was alone there. I was working as a landscaper, and at the time, I was really into jogging and reading and enjoying being by myself. One afternoon, I was laying on my bed reading, and I drifted off to sleep, he related. Darwin's nap was short-lived, however. I woke up to see the figure of a woman at my bedroom door. More embarrassed than frightened, he pretended to still be asleep. I rolled over before I looked again. She was gone, Darwin explained, before repeating for emphasis, there was a figure there. Not long after that brief encounter, Darwin's sister Joanne moved to Edmonton, and the two took over the upstairs apartment in the house. Both brother and sister are equally friendly and outgoing, and so for years the little house was a busy place, the venue for many happy times. Eventually Joanne met her future husband, Dennis. As the basement apartment was vacant once again, Darwin moved back downstairs and left the upstairs for the newlyweds. The slightly extended family continued to live and entertain happily under one roof until Joanne and Dennis were expecting their first child. They decided that the rented accommodation they enjoyed calling home for so long was no longer suitable. They bought a place of their own and moved out, leaving Darwin almost back where he started, alone in the basement apartment. Darwin knew, however, that he too would soon be moving. He and his girlfriend were planning a trip to Europe, after which they hoped to find an apartment together. I was rarely home during that time, Darwin recalled. I was working so much I didn't even eat there. The place began to feel gross, just ugly. It felt moist and dark and chilled. Joanne and I had been there for years, but now the house was just empty, void of life. It was always cold in that place. To make matters worse, Darwin's girlfriend was living and working in Vancouver at the time. As many couples in long-distance relationships do, the two began to experience problems. It was then that Darwin started to hear strange sounds from the empty upstairs suite. Before they left, Joanne and Dennis had taken the shower doors off the bathtub and had left them leaning against a wall. It sounded as though those doors had fallen. I thought I had heard them falling, scraping against the wall and then landing on the floor with a bang, but the noise wasn't quite loud enough. After listening to exactly the same noise 3 or 4 times in a week, Darwin decided he should investigate. I still had a key to the upstairs, so I went up. The shower doors were still there, leaning up against the wall. They hadn't slid down, and there was nothing else in the house that might explain the noise. Puzzled and increasingly uncomfortable, Darwin returned to his own apartment. A few days later, Darwin's girlfriend called from Vancouver. The conversation didn't go well, and soon a serious argument developed. The present that had been causing the unnerving scraping and banging sounds apparently responded to all this negativity with increasing strength. This time the noise was so loud that I wondered if a tree had hit the house. It was the same sound, only much louder. The scraping was still there, but this time, rather than being followed by a bang, it was followed by a loud boom. I began to realize the noises were coinciding with me feeling bad. It really scared me, Darwin recalled. We hung up then, but she called back and we continued the argument. As we talked, there were more scrapes and booms. The sound was coming from right over top of my head. I thought, wow, this is scary. And I knew it wasn't my imagination because my cat was responding to the sounds too. And at one point, the cupboard doors in my bathroom vibrated from one of the booms. Eventually, both the long-distance argument and frightening sounds ended for the night. However, the next day, I was going over the phone call in my mind, and the sounds started all over again, Darwin remarked. Darwin had been trying to explain his experiences to his friends, but the others put little stock in his reports, until he invited 3 of them over for dinner a few nights later. I'd been telling them about the noises, and before we ate, I showed them the empty apartment upstairs. About halfway through the meal, it started. Scrape. Boom. Darwin raised his voice for emphasis. I described the sounds so well that my friends recognized them. Once the presence had the young man's attention, apparently wasn't going to let up. It did it again during coffee, but not so loud that time, Darwin affirmed. After sharing the frightening experience with Darwin, his friends were no longer so anxious to disregard his antidotes. Not surprisingly, Darwin made an effort to spend as little time as possible at home. After 3.5 months of torment by an unseen but very noisy and responsive presence, he said goodbye to the place. As planned, Darwin and his girlfriend boarded a plane for Europe. Upon their return, the two found an apartment together. Their new place isn't too far from the little bungalow that had been Darwin's home for so many years. He still drives past the old place occasionally and was interested to note that there were new tenants, but only for a couple of weeks. Whoever moved in after him apparently moved back out again very quickly. Since then, the place has been sitting empty. Maybe. The house had an evil spirit. Often spirits are associated with one area of a building. A presence that is felt distinctively in one room will be totally absent in an adjoining one. Sometimes this phenomenon is puzzling, but in this story from Rocky Mountain House, there seems to be quite a reasonable explanation. It's an old house which had been built, so I'm told, by adding on bits and pieces of other buildings to the original. Central room of the house, explained Gordon Jackson, who was raised in the partially haunted house. The incidents that I'm about to tell you about happened in the part of the house that used to be my brother's bedroom. Gordon couldn't recall exactly how old he was when he first realized that there was something unnatural about his family's acreage home. He surmised, however, that he would have been roughly just preschool age. I remember quite vividly going into my brother's bedroom and going into the closet for something. When I opened the closet door, I remember seeing a face, a horrifying face, a definitely evil face. All but paralyzed with fear, Gordon fled from the room. I remember that I had thought it was my sister playing a terrible trick on me, and that I had been even more terrified when I saw her sitting in the living room with my mother. The human psyche will try to repress what it's not capable of dealing with, and to some extent Gordon's young mind was successful. I have since forgotten what the face actually looked like, which is fine by me, he confirmed. I have never forgotten the feeling of terror that it gave me, and ever after that I was never comfortable in that section of the house, he added. This feeling persisted for the youngster even though his parents had the house completely renovated, and what was once his brother's bedroom became the pantry. The way the renovations had been done, you had to go through the kitchen and pantry to get to the bathroom, and I remember many times running from the bathroom through the pantry in a panic, sure that something was after me, and then collecting myself in the kitchen so I could enter the living room where my parents sat, so that I didn't look like a fool, Gordon admitted. Gordon Jackson lived with this sense of an evil presence in one area of his family home until he left the fold. By the mid-1980s, both of Gordon's parents had died, and he was a college student living in Edmonton. During a break from school, he returned to Rocky Mountain House and the home he'd been raised in. Although I still owned the property, it was closed up and had not been lived in for several years, he explained. What happened next indicates that in his enumeration of the occupants, the young man may have overlooked the home's tenant of longest standing, the ghost. Like students everywhere, Gordon was very conscious of the need for thrift. I decided that I would camp out in the house, thus saving money. Unfortunately, his best intentions to serve the dual purposes of saving money and coming to grips with whatever had interfered so badly with his serenity during his formative years were not to turn out too well. I didn't even last long enough for true night to fall. I was out of the house before twilight was over, he explained, looking back on the experience. I remember quite strongly the smell of damp and disuse that had greeted me when I opened the door, and the frigid air that rushed past me. I very nearly left right then, and in retrospect, I wish I had. Gordon Jackson persisted with his plan. However, I set up camp in the living room. This was the original central building, and it had its own door, the front door. I cooked and ate supper outside on the porch that was attached to the front door, and everything was fine while I was outside. It was only when I returned to the living room inside that things began to happen. The next sensation that Gordon experienced was one that people who have had encounters with the paranormal almost always report. He explained it as a sort of something's watching you feeling, showing amazing Showing amazing courage and determination, Gordon turned to face in the direction I perceived the uneasiness as coming from. A mental duel of sorts began, courage against supernatural terror. The uneasiness began to grow stronger and stronger, he recounted, as if whatever was causing it was drawing nearer and nearer. Gordon looked past the living room into the two adjoining rooms, both with windows facing the same direction. The light from outside, though it was dim, was still bright enough for me to make out details in both rooms. Then I noticed the light in the kitchen was growing steadily darker and darker, and the light in the other room was staying the same. Temporarily rooted by sheer terror, Gordon analyzed the situation. Anything outside affecting the light should be affecting both rooms the same, as if something were blocking the light by standing in the kitchen window. It should have been visible. With chilling descriptive powers, Gordon continued. Instead, it seemed as though the darkness was gathering between the window and the doorway, gathering where as a child I saw the face connected to the bathroom, where I always felt a cold and prickly feeling, as if something was watching me. Gordon endured the horror-filled sensation for as long as he could. For just seconds, he reported. Then the darkness slowly made a move toward the living room, and my feet took over. I paused only long enough to lock the door behind me. Clearly, whatever the presence was, it certainly didn't want Gordon there. But at least it was content to remain in the house. The overwhelming sense of fear eased considerably once I was out of the house, he explained. Despite this relief, it took a while for Gordon to settle down. It wasn't until I reached the end of the driveway and was on my way back into town that I really began to feel better. I went back the next day with friends in broad daylight to collect the gear that I had left there the night before. Even then, I couldn't bring myself to go near the kitchen or the pantry. I just locked everything back up and left, Gordon affirmed. I never looked back. Jordan Jackson sold his rural estate and tried to put the past entirely behind him. He remarked, I have often wondered if whoever moved in after me has ever felt anything out of the ordinary, but I have never tried to find out. To this day, Gordon had no idea whether or not he was the only one of his family to have terrifying experiences in the family home. Perhaps other family members also had encounters, and like he was, were hesitant to share the information. Perhaps in lieu of communication with others, the man has devoted considerable mental energy to rationalize the events that took place in his childhood home. I have thought long and hard about my strange experiences and cannot come up with a solution that I can accept. In my heart, I know that what I felt and saw was some evil presence that haunted part of the house. I think that after the house was left empty, the presence grew stronger and more possessive, and that it was not happy about the fact I intended to stay there, he concluded. This is not the first time I've heard of hauntings, especially unpleasant ones, that have apparently gained in strength over the time that a house was unoccupied, by live people, that is.